So I'm going to talk a little bit about my dissertation research that I've been working on the last 4 years. And so this is work in progress that I'm presenting. So it's really it's an overview of what I've been working on, and I'm really emphasizing what I consider the integrative components of my research. So how using different disciplines are really speaking to each other and leading to novel framings and also novel conclusions, I feel, in my own work that I wouldn't have come to if I'd used one of these disciplines by themselves. So, but it's a little bit light on details in some of the methodology. So I think it's going to be a little unsatisfying in that regard, but I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards about it if you have any questions or want any more depth on anything I did. Dr. Goldman already gave a really nice introduction to pastoralism, so I'm just going to skip over this part for the most part, but just so most of you know that it's a livelihood where the majority of one's livelihood comes from livestock husbandry. So it's really distinct from commercial cattle production in the sense that the breeds of animals are really, the focus is on being able to travel long distances, but also the ability to withstand high heat and drought. And so historically, this is changing somewhat, but there's been an emphasis on milk production and pastoralist production rather than consumptive use of the animals. So that has to do with the breeds, culture, a number of things like revolve around this aspect of pastoralism. And then there's really unique social structure, and this is just a brief overview as it pertains to my research, but because I'm leaving out cultural components and a lot of other complex characteristics of pastoralism. But really for this talk, I just wanted you to keep in mind that the forage resources are held in common. The animals are individually owned, but the forage resources are thought of as belonging to everybody. And there are complex networks of reciprocity that mediate access to forage resources across the landscape, reciprocity and authority that relate to that. So just to distinguish it. So the livelihoods are really intimately tied and tightly coupled to vegetation resources. And in semi-arid dynamics, rainfall is really variable across the landscape in space and time. And so this really determines the amount of the vegetation resource. So ability to move in a semi-arid environment is really key for herders and wildlife alike to be able to buffer that variability. And this is just an image from my study site. You can see at the top here, this top picture is following about a year with very little rainfall. The second picture is about 9 months later, and there's still been no rainfall at this point. And there's not really much that resembles a blade of grass at all in that picture, and you could in fact conclude that that was degraded. But then a couple of months later, following a fair amount of rainfall, there's a flush of perennial grass that comes back in this area. So this kind of relates to one of the problematic areas of study in the past where concepts of stability and ecology were applied to these dynamics that were sort of inappropriate in the past. And it's led to a lot of social science critiques of ecological analyses of rangelands, in addition to the focus on the local interactions that were frequently emphasized in rangeland studies, so looking at the impact of the animals on the vegetation resources, and then also focusing on stocking rates and things like population and the breakdown of customary management regimes. So basically coming in and saying there's no management regime in place here, not acknowledging pastoralist institutions in the past. And then from the other side, the social science perspective often doesn't consider the ecological impacts of the animals and how that can feed back on livelihoods. So the dynamics of the vegetation directly. And there are exceptions to this where a lot of people in political ecology and social science have looked at certain aspects of this, but frequently it's left out on the social science side, where there's been an emphasis maybe on mobility and the impact on livelihoods, but that ecological component hasn't been included explicitly. So, and this is changing, and there are exceptions to this, but just historically, they've been very divided. So with my approach, I'm really trying to consider livelihoods and ecological changes side by side, but then also considering knowledge of ecological changes. So the way that different actors view ecological changes that they've seen throughout their lifetimes in this area. So the theory that I'm drawing on is mainly from social ecological systems and political ecology, and taking these perspectives side by side and seeing them both as partial, but in the overlapping area having the ability to generate new perspectives of looking at problems in rangelands. So I'm using a hybrid methodology that's drawing on livelihoods analysis, landscape ecology, and ethnoecology, all side by side. And so the study site where I've been working in central Kenya is Laikipia County. And historically, there have been a lot of changes in this area from the 1900s on in terms of land use, where in the early 1900s, the British colonial authority removed most pastoralists from this area. And today, this area that's in dark yellow, this is the main area occupied by pastoralists. It's about 7% of Laikipia County. The brown areas are privately held ranches that were formerly commercial cattle production ranches for export of cattle that have recently, in the last 20 years, become conservation ranches. So, and over the last 30 years in particular, there have been changes in, so there's this historic loss of grazing access for pastoralists in this area, but over the last 30 years, there's been decreased access outside of this area. So in the past, pastoralists could move from this area out into these private lands, but there's been decreased access outside of those areas. So at the same time, a number of ecological changes have happened in the plant community composition and the structure of the plant communities. And so my main objective, or my first objective, is to understand how those changes relate to herding practices and how herding practices have changed over the same 30, 35-year time period. And the second one is to look at how social factors have mediated these changes in herding practices. So things like access and other institutional factors that could be impacting herding practices. And then thirdly, to gain a comparative understanding of how different actors view ecological change. So what different actors attribute these changes to, what they see as the drivers of these changes. So I've drawn on ethnographic methods to understand aspects of all of these first. And so I've used surveys with all households, and these surveys have tried to cover how people's livelihoods have changed throughout this time. But then I've also done key informant interviews to get an in-depth understanding of the types of change and how people understand these changes and how they've impacted them and the different incentives for different herding practices. And then I've also done key informant interviews on how people perceive the ecological changes, and I'll talk more about that in a second. So the first sort of main finding of this from the survey data is that there have been 3 distinct periods of changes in access, where the first period is in the 1980s. This is what I mentioned about access to these private ranches, that access has really decreased since the 1980s, where changes in those private landholders' policies, they decided to start excluding pastoralists from these lands. And that had to do with changes in the owner mentality, but also in conservation practices, so wildlife conservation practices that resulted in herders being excluded. And secondly, so conflict in the mid-1990s. This really limited movement up, if you look back at this map, movement up through the north and to the west throughout this area. There was a lot of conflict between other pastoralist groups that limited access to grazing resources this way. So in the 1980s, there was limitation of access to this side, and then in the 90s, limitation to this side. And the most recent changes have actually happened due to conservancy formation, where different pastoralist groups have formalized their land and gained title for their land and entered into conservation agreements with private landholders. And as a result of these conservation trusts that have been formed, they've started excluding other pastoralist groups from these lands. So at the same time these changes in access have been happening, there have been large decreases in the numbers of cows over that same time, but large increases in the numbers of small stock, sheep and goats. And this is thought to be related to their drought tolerance, as well as the the fast reproduction and ability to sell these animals. And so this is thought to be interrelated to these changes in access for cattle, where people are really shifting away from cattle that are really reliant on the reserve grazing grass in these other areas. And so that herding success is really structured, like stratified, we found. That it's related to employment and access to lands where people are privately employed on these conservation ranches. Then they're allowed to come there with their animals. And so that's really shaping the success of cattle herding. And those that aren't able to gain access in this way are really dependent on contested areas. So they're dependent on illicit grazing in these areas. And overall, there's this pattern of increasing individualization of risk, where people aren't herding together. People are herding their own animals by family. So in the past, people collaborated between families. So, and the upshot of combining these frameworks the way that I have really shows that this social stratification is also ecologically uneven, and structuring the ecological patterns and changes in landscape pressure in certain ways due to this stratification, because the people that aren't moving with their animals have a much more localized impact with the small stock, which have a very different impact on the forage resources. And so then this is also likely creating an ecological feedback that's decreasing the local availability of grass regrowth during the wet seasons. And so then I talked to herders about the way that they've seen ecological changes happen throughout their lifetime, throughout the last 30 years. There have been really significant changes in the dominant tree species canopy, composition, and also changes in perennial grasses and vines, and encroachment of a number of unpalatable species. So in talking about these kinds of transitions that people have perceived, I've used the MA concepts of different landscape forms. So there's a taxonomy, the way that herders talk about the landscape. So using those terms in the different states that are possible and the transitions that can happen between these different states. Kind of talked about this systematically with herders about how they see these changes and what they see driving these changes. And so this is really stands in, the way that herders are viewing the landscape really stands in sharp contrast to the way that conservation actors in the gray literature and in informal conversations that I've had with a lot of conservationists in this area, they see these changes primarily due to overgrazing, primarily due to cattle, the impacts of cattle, that there are basically too many cattle in this area, and there's also a lack of management. So there's really a fundamental lack of acknowledgement of this management. But herders at the same time see these changes primarily due to drought. And the changes in tree canopy species that they see are primarily due to elephants impacting the trees. And then small stock will be acknowledged as having some impact on the grasses locally, but really drought is the main thing that herders talk about that are causing these ecological changes. So I'm trying to use that to inform a satellite-based landscape ecological analysis, also with plant-based methods, to look at the changes in plant composition and how the different trajectories of this transition shape what's there today, what we see today on the ground. And so those accounts of vegetation changes from herders, so I've tried to not use this as data necessarily, or to like think of this in terms of who's right or wrong about thinking about this, but just thinking of it, this is a different view of this landscape that's in contrast with the strictly ecological view. So trying to use that to guide my interpretation of satellite imagery and generate hypotheses about the changes that have happened. And so just in conclusion, the uneven access is exacerbating stratified livelihoods that are in turn having ecological feedbacks. And conservation actors and pastoralists have very contrasting views of ecological change. And maybe the most important upshot is that those historical critiques of rangeland studies aren't actually being incorporated into practice today. So there's still this divide, and this really, I think, speaks to this point that Dr. Goldman made about these boundaries between knowledge spaces and talking across those. So just in closing, I think there's a need for earnest exchanges across these boundaries between different groups. And all these people are wonderful. But all of this work was done with Naptari Washira. So he was my field tech throughout this. I could not have done a lot of this work without him, and it's thanks to my committee members and everyone else. Okay, thanks.